Welcome back, everyone. It has been a little while since I've done a video talking about uranium, and with the nuclear fuel working group and the buzz about them potentially doing something to help domestic uranium production, I figured I would do a video talking about what they could do and what effects that might have just roughly on the US and global uranium market. Now, quick warning though, you might not like all of what I have to say on the topic. So the first and simplest thing that they could do is they could do direct purchases from US miners. Now, this would be one of the simplest things, and it would also be kind of the most demand positive thing, although it will add risk later on if they do it in a kind of run of the mill or winging it type way, because later on this these purchases probably won't go forever, and then the US government might have some inventory that they could later either stop buying or start selling into the market at a time when miners aren't expecting it. But this is would be for the time being positive, and if they were to say, okay, so we're going to buy X pounds at 70 to 75 bucks, which is high enough for most uranium mining projects in the US to make money, and this would keep the industry strong, maybe growing in the US, and add demand globally. Now, long term, the growth in the US might have challenges for the market globally, but in the near term, it would get things off the ground and the added demand would be helpful. Now, they don't have to do it in a way that they're saying we're going to buy at $75 or whatever the price is. They could also implement a bid system, and I'll talk a bit more about how that could work later. But the one thing I would clarify is if they go this route of direct purchases, I think it's very critical that they announce in advance the timeline that they're going to do it and not just flip it on, flip it off, because that could end up doing more damage than the help that it would cause now. So the second thing they could do is subsidize US uranium. And this could happen in a number of ways. They could do it on the supply side or the demand side. But the bottom line is this would probably help US miners, although it would be doing so at the expense of the market more generally. If they were to subsidize, let's say, the costs of mining uranium in the US by whether it's tax cuts or just subsidies, well, this would lower the cost of the US production and thus overall lower the cost of uranium long term. Now, doing so would add to the market some otherwise questionably economic uranium, and in addition to this, as I said, lowering the cost curve, it would basically turn the US producers into what they were, uh, why they started 232. It would turn them into basically what they said Kazatomprom was, and that subsidized by the state, and so it wasn't fair. Well, yeah. Um, Now, they could also add subsidies to the demand side, i.e. a tax credit for buying US uranium. Now, this could have a similar effect of setting US uranium at a premium and thus incentivizing some less than otherwise economic sources, which would help the US producers at the cost of global producers. Now, if I were forced into doing something like this, because it is not what my primary choice, but if I were forced into it, I would try and set it up in a way that's fair and reasonable so that and I would do this by making a partial tax credit for US sourced uranium. So, for example, let's say the price of uranium was $65 globally. Um, it could be set up so that this would effectively cost $50 for the utilities if they were buying US. And so this would allow some of the US slightly higher costs, but marginally economic to production to be worth buying by US utilities. Now on to part three. Now this isn't exactly to do with domestic uranium production, but when Section 232 was initiated, my main concern with the process was that I could argue, probably effectively, to a degree, that enrichment, US domestic enrichment of uranium, was potentially as big, if not more of a threat to national security than the uranium mining itself. Now, here's the thing. Because of the mechanics of the fuel cycle and math, if the US wanted to fix this problem by, let's say, investing in or sponsoring some sort of domestic enrichment facility, well, that could actually be a negative for the uranium market in general, including US production. Now, this is because if this were to happen, this could increase the secondary supply because it would add or decrease uh, I mean, it would add SWU supply, so increase SWU demand, SWU separative work unit, um, and thus increase underfeeding. And so it's especially ironic in my mind, at least, because if this were done to a decent extent, it could actually produce more, I'm using air quotes here, domestically sourced fuel than what actually comes from the US uranium mining sector. The last real option that I wanted to discuss here is investment. Because when people hear investment, they think that's positive. And that is kind of true as a whole. But realistically, when you're talking investment, what it leads to is more efficient market and lower prices. So if the US decided it was going to invest in exploration, development, or efficiency technologies for miners, for example, well, longer term, that would actually lead to lower uranium prices, which it, this initiative might help some domestic companies, but overall, over the global market, it would eventually lead to lower prices. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's probably healthy for utilities and such, and the degree to which it might be effective is also questionable. But it's a possibility. Same thing with if they were to ease permitting. It, again, would help some companies, but overall, it's a small impact, but globally, a slight negative. Now, is that saying it shouldn't happen? No. It's just looking at what would happen. And on the flip side, if the US wanted to help the miners price-wise without, let's say, picking favorites necessarily, they could also invest in reactors on the demand side or make ease of permitting for reactors less lengthy and less cumbersome, which would help increase demand. Now, this wouldn't particularly target helping US miners, but it would help the uranium space more generally. So, if you were to ask what I would do, well, I like to believe kind of in generally that I'd do nothing because I happen to believe that A, free markets and fairness should be the primary driver in the world, even if it's at my own expense, which it is at times. But I also think that B, and this is probably more to the point in this case, it won't matter either way in 2 years if nothing is done. If something is done, then it might not matter, but in a longer period of time. But this is an entirely different discussion. I can, however, see the merits of having a strategic stockpile. However, this isn't going to be my suggestion of what I do because it's immensely self-serving and can't be taken seriously if I were to suggest it. So here is, if forced to implement something, what I'd do. I'd offer to refill the military stockpiles at this depressed point in the market, um, and recuperate some of the uranium that's been, you could kind of say, dumped over the past few years. And I think you could reasonably suggest to do this from domestic US uranium production and at a fair price. And this is how I'd implement it. Okay, the implementation. Because uranium mines are not light switches, you don't turn them off and on, don't ramp them up for 1 year of production, then turn it off if the price is too low. I mean, you can, but that's really not optimal. I would, as the government, say, okay, we're going to, over the next decade, buy, I don't know, 20 million pounds, 30 million pounds, whatever the number you want to do. And I would take bids, basically. So if you are a US producer, potential producer of uranium, you could submit a bid, and let's say you'll say I'll produce 5 million pounds over that time at $40 a pound. Then the government would say, take that 5 million and say, okay, well, next best bids for 15 million over that time. So I think that would serve the purpose of keeping the US uranium production alive, because it would have to get the however many pounds that was needed. It would help the market at a time of depressed need. It wouldn't crash the market. It wouldn't dump on the market after, because the US does need strategic uranium for its military. And it would be, in my view, fair and predictable to the market. So the US would take that 20 million pounds, that's added demand for that time. And then after, the market knows that the demand is going away then. And so it would continue. Now, is this fair? Is this biased? I don't really think so, but if you think it is, then I'd love to hear why. But I think overall it's reasonable. And if forced to do something, this is what I think I'd do. So, in conclusion, I am sure that many people are excited about potential action, potential help for US uranium miners. And that's fine. I have nothing against that. Personally, it's not my primary motive or goal, but no problem. Now, just I just want to point out so that people realize that it's not necessarily going to be something that helps globally. I think the idea is something that will help the US, but there will potentially be side effects. And so just remember that anything that works to bring on more supply has the potential to slow down the lowering of inventories and reduce the supply and demand deficit. And, well, if you think it is a deficit, and slow the recovery. So just wanted to point that out. And that's it for today. I hope we can get back to normal market operations very soon. And until then, have a great day. Hey everyone, just quickly, you can read this here or in the description of any video. Just remember, what I do and say here is meant to be a helpful supplement or thought filter for your research, not a replacement for it. I can be wrong, and I'm often quite early, aka wrong for a good while, which is why none of this is ever investment advice.